Hi friends, John Wesley here from the Sense of Shelf podcast, and I want to tell you about Anchor. Anchor is what I use to record this delightful podcast that I am very thankful you're listening to. And Anchor has all the tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. And from personal experience, editing from your phone is surprisingly easy and intuitive. And when you host your podcast on Anchor, you can distribute it to all the listening platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. It is literally everything you need to make your podcast all in one place, one easy app. And best of all, it is totally free. So if you find yourself thinking that you may want to start a podcast, I recommend you download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get yourself started. Thank you for listening, and God bless. Hi friends, my name is John Wesley, and welcome to the Sense of Shelf podcast with another episode of the Pen Made Mightier by the Sword, where we take a brief look at authors and the influences of war and global conflict on their works. On this episode today, we're talking about who has become known as one of the greatest British writers of the last 100 years, Mr. George Orwell. He's so well known and so revered that the man has an adjective in the dictionary named after him, being Orwellian. Ironically, as we'll find out, it describes totalitarian social practices, and that's something he was very outspoken against. George Orwell, born Eric Arthur Blair, was born in Bengal, British India, modern-day India, in 1903. His father was a sub-deputy opium agent in the opium department of the Indian Civil Service. In 1904, his mother moved the family from British India to Oxfordshire, England, and he actually never even saw his father until 1912 when he was 9 years old. So, unlike some of the people we talk about in this, he didn't have the best childhood. He understood that he was from a family that was, sort of less well off than a lot of the people around him. As a teen in school, he wrote a little bit for essays. He wrote essays and wrote for assignments. And Orwell and his friend at the time, Jacinta, dreamed of becoming famous writers. And he said at one point he would write a book in the style of H.G. Wells, which you can sort of see in some of his works. He was once quoted while speaking about H.G. Wells, quote, "The minds of all of us, and therefore the physical world, would be perceptibly different if Wells had never existed," end quote. He did all the things that writers of this time did, which I mentioned in some other episodes. He attended Eton for secondary school. He lived all over Europe in different cities. He was a teacher for a little while. And getting to his work, George is the author of George Orwell, let me put some respect. George Orwell is the author of two of the most well-known books, being Animal Farm and 1984, which I'm sure most of you have read at least one of. In getting to the war and global conflict, in 1936, Orwell went to Spain to report on the Spanish Civil War, and while there, he joined the Republican militia. He was wounded, and damage to his throat permanently affected his voice. In 1937, he was forced to flee Spain after fighting against communists who were now working to suppress opponents. He wrote Homage to Catalonia, an autobiographical telling of these experiences, which is widely considered his best book. When World War II came around, Orwell was rejected for service. He worked as a journalist during this time, first for the Indian service of the BBC, then as literary editor for the Tribune. And you could look at two periods in his life to see his inspirations for both Animal Farm and 1984. The wartime and his service in the Spanish Civil War being one of them. But as a young man, he worked for the Indian Imperial Police. It was this work that helped him realize how the British were ruling the Burmese people against their will, and this shamed him into resigning from the Imperial Police. In an attempt to alleviate some of this guilt and shame he felt about the treatment of the Burmese people, he immersed himself in the life of the poor and outcast European populations. He lived among laborers and beggars. He worked as a dishwasher in French hotels. Today, this would be seen as, at best, misguided, I would say, and at worst, really a gross example of white privilege, to just sort of dip your toes into the life of the downtrodden like that and then escape back to your real life. But getting back to specifically war experiences and the influence of these on his works, Animal Farm was finished in 1944 and is a very clear allegory of Joseph Stalin and his betrayal of the Russian Revolution. In the story, barnyard animals overthrow the human masters to set up their own egalitarian society. In time, the pigs who lead this society subvert the revolution to form a more oppressive bondage than that of the human masters. This was in turn followed by and then overshadowed by 1984, written as a warning of Nazism and Stalinism. The book is set in a dystopian future ruled by 3 totalitarian police states. The main character works for one of these states, and he begins to rebel against his government that rules by distorting truth and rewriting history. Does that sound familiar? Either from history class or from recent history. While Orwell's military experience was limited to the Spanish Civil War, which directly gave us homage to Catalonia, his knowledge of and feelings toward war and the people responsible for it brought us 2 of the most famous books of the 20th century. I should also mention his book, Coming Up for Air, which was written in 1939, which examines England and its past and future threatened by war and fascism. So, we can very clearly see the influence of war and global conflict on 2 of the most famous fiction, I wouldn't say books, novella for Animal Farm, but definitely novel for 1984. 2 of the most famous stories from the 20th century. Personally, I'm a fan of both, enjoying 1984 a little more than Animal Farm. But everyone knows the name Orwell, Orwellian. I mean, how many authors have an adjective from their name in the dictionary? That tells you the reach of this man's works and just how poignant they are nowadays in today's society, as opposed to when they were, obviously they were relevant when they were written, but to have it come back around like that is pretty wild. But we all know history repeats itself. So that is this installment of the Pen Made Mightier by the Sword. This time about Mr. George Orwell and the effects of war and global conflict and how it gave us 1984 and Animal Farm. 2 books where I'm sure you've read at least one of them. I thank you for joining me on this episode. Please, whichever platform you are using, go ahead and subscribe, rate, and review. Let me know how I'm doing. I do like to know what everyone thinks. So go ahead and do that, whether you're on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, etc., etc. And go show love to my fellow independent podcasters, my good friend Ben Hunt at the Enlightened Podcast, talking about all things nerd, whether Marvel, Star Wars, Harry Potter, just like cult comedies. And he's actually got a good knowledge of history that him and one of his co-hosts like to talk about occasionally, and he knows his Beatles music. So go ahead and check him out. If any of those things interest you, go ahead, subscribe, rate, and review to him as well. That's The Enlightened Podcast with Ben Hunt. And go check out Gally Gambles at Beantown Action Podcasts. He's got, I think, 3 different shows under that banner. So go give him a listen. Lots of sports, a little bit of gambling and fantasy sports. And his show, The Distinguished Gentleman, which is him and 3 friends. And they just talk about life in general and music and pop culture and sports. And they always have an alcohol to go along with the episode. So again, go check out Chris Galley at Beantown Action Podcasts, and check out all their socials as well. Enlightened Pod 1, I believe, on Twitter, and Gally Gambles for the other Twitter. So go ahead and check them out, follow. You'll get all the updates on their shows. And I think that does it for this episode. Thank you for joining me on the Sense of Shelf podcast with my little mini episode, The Pen Made Mightier by the Sword, about authors and the effects, the influences of war and global conflict on their works. Please feel free to message me. Let me know if there's an author you would like to hear about. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Sense of Shelf Pod. Or you could just go ahead and email me if you avoid social media, which I completely understand. I have a Gmail, senseofshelfpod@gmail.com. So please get in touch with me. Let's have a conversation about an author you would like to hear me research and give a little brief history of, as far as how war has influenced them. So thank you. My name is John Wesley. I appreciate you listening. God bless.